Okay, so we just finished talking about anxiety and stress as well as building relationships. Now, real quick before we get into the next piece, if you are a behavior analyst, talking about anxiety is kind of a mentalistic type thing, and so we think, is that something that we as behavior analysts really need to be concerned about? And I would say that in some of the work that I've looked at, really understanding that anxiety can kind of be thought of as a motivating operation or an establishing operation. So we know that establishing operations increase the value of reinforcement and behavior to get that reinforcer. So what happens, I believe, with anxiety is that it makes negative reinforcement more valuable, right? So I'm having some anxiety and getting the heck out of here has become more valuable. So we tend to see sometimes more escape behaviors. And if you are interested in learning more about some of those kinds of things, Dr. Joe Lang and the work on Israel Golddiamond is excellent in helping to understand how to look at some of the respondent behaviors that we think about, like fear and anxiety, in a behavioral way. So certainly look into some of that additional work as well. So getting into then kind of what I consider proactive strategies. So like these are things that I want to make sure that we set up ahead of time before doing the actual Rage to Reason. I tell people that Rage to Reason kind of has two components. One is we use behavior analysis to teach kids to be compliant again, and that's an important piece. We want kids to follow directions and learn from their environment in school. But there's another piece is that we really want to teach that regulation, right? We want to teach them to be able to have coping skills and regulate their emotions. And so what I like to tell people is that typically using behavior strategies to get kids to follow directions again doesn't take very long. But teaching a child to not get dysregulated when someone makes fun of their middle name on the playground takes longer. And so some of those kinds of skill deficits and skill building requires some longer intervention. So I start with that piece, and that we really look that we're setting up an environment that addresses the dysregulation and coping skills and some of those kinds of things. So that's why I kind of call these proactive strategies. They would be the things that we would want to set up in the environment prior to any kind of actual plan. And so with the proactive strategies, there's a couple of things. We want to teach regulation. Kids don't have good regulation skills. I want to teach that. We'll also talk a little bit about academic modifications and slight little bit about empathy and problem solving. We don't get into that too much in this training, but really starting by focusing on that regulation. And so regulation, if we talk about self-regulation, is the ability to detect how you're feeling, match emotions to events, and then change the level of behavior and emotions to match the environment and cultural expectations. That's by Brenda Smith-Miles, excellent speaker if you have an opportunity, works a lot with kids with autism. But self-regulation is kind of tough, right? Like I'm feeling frustrated and I have to detect that and I have to do what's appropriate for this situation. A couple of kids that I'm working with right now, they're still having trouble with that regulation. When they get upset about something, whether it's a peer that triggers it, they kind of still have this big reaction. And so this particular parent was asking me, like, how long does that take to teach a kid to be able to handle when things are frustrating? And I said, like, I don't really have an answer to that, but do you know adults who get frustrated that don't handle that very well? Like the whole thing of when you're feeling frustrated and having a appropriate response is not easy for even adults to do. So sometimes those things can take a while to develop. Now, one of the things that I talk about is one of my books here called The Incredible 5-Point Scale. This is by Carrie Dunn Burren and Mitzi Curtis. I don't use this exclusively, but I like for people to kind of understand how it works. And the idea is that emotions and regulation and those kinds of things are typically on a scale. And so the front here shows like a 1 is where they say, I'm really regulated, I'm happy, there's a smiley face. And a 5 is the extreme other end where I'm extremely dysregulated. And this is their second edition, so they actually have an example of a student that actually filled one out that I want to share. So this particular student described his 1 level as that he was playing hockey and he feels like $1 million. At a 2, he described himself as a regular kid and not weird, and he felt good. At a 3, he said, I'm quiet and sometimes I'm rude when I talk, but I feel like I'm in a bad mood and I'm grumpy. Okay, at a 4, he says, I'm screaming at people and almost hitting, right? He underlines almost hitting. But it's interesting because the feeling he chose was nervous. And then at a 5, he says, that's when I'm hitting or kicking and I feel like my head will explode. This is really cool that a kid can identify all of these different levels. Some of our kids can't. And so they need to be taught how to recognize, like, I'm a 2 or I'm a 3. And what we want is to really get kids to be able to catch those early signs of feeling dysregulated, and then to have a list of strategies or tools where they can get themselves back on track. And that's really the piece that we want to do. I mean, some kids will say, I go from a 1 to a 5, and I don't have any space in between. And that's part of what some of the curriculum should involve, is really teaching kids those skills. Now, again, we kind of talked about this some. This is what Dr. Green refers to in part of his explosive child work, is that during a meltdown, so I'm going to consider that a level 5, right? If I just looked at my 5-point scale, where 5 is where kids are in a full meltdown, children lose up to 30 IQ points in their ability to understand directions, process language, and learn from consequences. So many of you know 100 is an average IQ. 30 points puts us at a 70, and that's the cutoff for an intellectual disability, what people used to refer to as MR. So that's a lot of processing and not understanding. So what I always tell people is, when kids get to that level 5, and maybe they are in a meltdown, our only goal at that time is safety, right? We got to keep the kids safe. We got to get them kind of, back to a place where they can, are not a 5, moving to a 4, to a 3, and getting themselves regulated again. There's not a lot of teaching. Sometimes I have parents who are like, I don't know what to do when they're, having their meltdown. I need to teach them. That's not the time to teach them how to not have a meltdown. That's the time to keep them safe, which means that a lot of what we want to do with all of our interventions with these kids, whether it's a child with autism or someone with a mental health need, is that everything should be proactive, right? We want to try to do things before the behavior. Sometimes it's still going to occur. We keep the child safe. We're going to try again next time. So this is a cartoon that I actually saw the first time I got to hear Dr. Green speak. And he was, I think Alex was only 3 or 4 years old. So it's the first time I was really exposed to some of the work that Dr. Green was doing, and also, again, recognizing that some of this behavior is the result of a skill deficit. But this was very helpful for me because, we've got this kid drowning and the lifeguard sitting there. He's not doing anything about it. But Dr. Green in his presentation said, do you think it would work very well with this drowning student if you said, hey, Joey, if you stop drowning and swim to shore right now, I will buy you a brand new Xbox game? Obviously, that's not going to work. Or you could do the opposite, right? Joey, quit your drowning, come in here right now, or you're losing your recess for the whole week. That's not going to work. And this, honestly, as a parent, was the first time that I was like, oh, that maybe makes sense with what was going on with Alex. Because again, reinforcement and consequences didn't matter, but that's because he was drowning. He didn't know how to swim. He was missing so many skills in being able to tolerate frustration and be flexible that it didn't matter. Again, it's the little girl, the 8th grade student, that I can't say, if you take notes today, I'll buy you a soda. That's not going to work. And this was kind of interesting. So I have 3 kids. I always tell people, like, God gave me a lot of patience for my son, Alex, who has bipolar and some anxiety and those kinds of things. My daughter, on the other hand, not so much. I think we have a daughter-mom thing going on sometimes. But it's difficult sometimes when you have kids and you have to have different responses for your kids, because when Alex is upset, he sometimes uses inappropriate language. And when he's in a 5, that's not the time to teach it. So there's times that I just don't really pay too much attention to it, and I don't give a lot of attention, and I try to kind of get him back on track. Well, my daughter, when she was 16, told me to shut up. I'm like, that's not okay, it's disrespectful, you have a consequence for that. And she's like, well, that's not fair because Alex has, he says this and you don't do anything about it. I was like, well, that makes sense. I'm sure 16, she doesn't quite understand that. So I love using my visuals. Brian and I took our 2 kids, Andrew and Katie, the 2 younger ones, out to dinner, and I actually brought this, and I said, we haven't really sat down. I know that your brother has some difficulty. He has bipolar. I know we've talked about that before. I wanted to explain it some to them because they need to know that this is probably something that he's going to deal with forever. But I showed this to my daughter, Katie, and I said, would it work when Alex was really mad if I said, stop using language and getting so mad and I'll buy you an Xbox? And she's like, no, I guess you're right. I said, yeah, that's because he doesn't know how to swim. He's missing so many skills because of the mental health needs. I said, you, my dear, know how to swim. So when you tell me to shut up, there's going to be a consequence. Now, it's not that she was like, okay, Mom, I get it. She didn't really like it, but helping them and people to see that a purposeful behavior is not the same as something that is a skill deficit. So what a lot of times people will describe as a can't versus a won't, right? I can't do it, I can't see the board, or I won't do it. I know darn well how to see the board, I'm choosing not to. And separating those two things is what's going to help us provide the best support for kids. So if the child is being non-compliant, let's say we've got this kid and he's drowning, right? The first thing, like if we have a kid and they're refusing, if you did an FBA or a functional behavior assessment on this drowning kid, they were refusing to swim, the behavior, your results would come out as an escape and avoid. This kid is trying to escape swimming. So then sometimes we would write a behavior plan. Maybe we decide we're going to increase reinforcement, right? We're going to give a token each time the student swims. Tokens will be able to be exchanged for stuff from the classroom store on Friday. And then each time the student refuses to swim, he'll lose recess for the day. And we take data and monitor that plan. Now, when I give this example for a kid that's drowning and doesn't know how to swim, it seems silly. Yet I think we're doing this a lot with some of our kids, and that we're writing these plans that are not working because, again, we're trying to reinforce a skill deficit. So my joke here is that you go home every day, why won't he just knock it off and stop drowning and listening to me? I must not have the right reinforcer. Maybe he needs to spend more time with the assistant principal. Or again, like maybe you're like, I think I'm going to check online to see if there are any job openings driving a UPS truck because I'm done teaching, right? And so we really just kind of have to look at maybe our frustration with why some of these things are not working, or again, are related more to a can't versus a won't. And then I add again, is that sometimes it's both. And that's where we really have to look at all of these variables. Regulation, it's important to know that you cannot operate under the belief that he or she knows what or how to do something just because he or she has done it in the past. And I've mentioned this a couple times. Oh, I know he knows how to do this math. He did it last week. I know he knows it. He's done it before. That remember, every opportunity to respond and their success is based on their level of regulation. So being very well regulated, I might be able to demonstrate it. When anxiety has hijacked my frontal lobe and my executive function skills are not working very well, I may not be able to initiate and demonstrate that I have this skill. Another curriculum that we use, this one is called The Zones of Regulation. I don't know if you guys are using this. It's by Leah Coopers. She is an occupational therapist, worked many years helping kids, a lot of kids with autism, regulate their sensory systems. She actually read the work of Dr. Ross Green, really bought into it and said, you know what, we're not doing a very good job regulating emotional systems. So she put this curriculum together along with some work from somebody named Michelle Garcia Winter. She does all the stuff on social thinking and also kind of modeled it after the 5-point scale. So one of the things that she does is she uses color to be able to indicate like where kids are on a scale of dysregulation. And so the green is when kids are in like this good zone. It says happy, calm, feeling okay. Yellow is when they start becoming dysregulated. On here it says frustrated, worried, kind of loss of some control. And red is when they're mad, they're angry, they're yelling. I also like she does this direction too. I don't know if you can see that, but it's got the blue zone, which is sad, sick, tired, and not motivated. That can also cause some dysregulation, right? What I love about her curriculum, I guess two things. Very easy to implement in that it's set up in lessons, right? So you open it up, it's lesson 1, and you learn about the zones. And there's all kinds of things in the book that help you make posters with the facial expressions that you cut out, that happy goes in the green zone and sad might go in the yellow zone, and then they play bingo. And so there's lots of fun things that kids can do to go through. Specifically towards the end is really teaching the skills on what to do. And she talks about in the beginning that you do not teach kids that there's something wrong with being in a zone other than green. I had a little guy and he told me, he's like, oh, I did that in school. When I was in the red, I was in trouble. I'm like, no, you're not in trouble. We all feel different feelings in different zones. You might feel the best in a green zone, and if you're not, you just want to have the tools to get back there, right? I've been frustrated with traffic before. I've been sad. I've been, unmotivated and those kinds of things, but I have tools to get myself to where I want to be. And this was Cody, my little guy. Remember, he drew the line like so close to the breaking point because he was trying to tell his mom that he was frustrated. When I showed him this, he's like, Miss Amy, I go from green to red. I don't feel yellow. I don't even know what you're talking about. And I said, I know, buddy. That's why we're going to go through this, because I want you to start feeling yellow so you can say, hey, I'm feeling yellow. Can I go do this? Because if you have a kid completely dysregulated, you're not going to get them to do math. Regulation has to come first. And so this particular book has a lot of really good ideas within the curriculum that I'll share, along with some of my own things that I've learned about. So there's ways to teach regulation. We can have sensory and movement, relaxation, and then some cognitive behavior strategies. So we'll go through a couple of these. One of them, it talks about the stress management station, right? That's just the name that I came up with. Creating something in your classroom or in a home setting where you have a place that it's okay to go if you need to regulate yourself, right? So, that might be for a little kid or a young classroom, it might be the cozy corner. You have to come up with something maybe more appropriate for high school. But the idea is there's a place in your classroom, and it's not to go have free time, it's literally to work on regulation. So some of the things that we know can be helpful kind of fall under the sensory area. We know through research that tension release activities are helpful. I'm sure you've worked with kids that it's almost like you're walking on eggshells, right? Like they just seem agitated and it's like a volcano and they're gonna blow. And then afterwards they almost feel better. There's some literature that says that tension release activities where you're tensing in your muscles on a regular basis. It could also include exercise where I have a kid that every morning he comes in and he plays basketball for 10 minutes. Well, not only does he like it, it wears him out some, And so these kinds of things should be on a regular basis, not just when you see dysregulation. When I was teaching still in the classroom, they didn't have like the yoga for kids. I'm not sure I would have put that in my classroom, but it could be something like that where there's some movement and that kind of thing. Another one I oftentimes talk about is a stress or a mad basket. I usually call it a stress basket, but I had one of my students with Asperger's syndrome. He's like, I'm calling it my mad basket. And I said, okay. I've had kids that it seems like when they first start showing some of those levels of dysregulation, that they tend to start manipulating things and eventually can even be somewhat destructive. So if you have a kid that's upset, you say, hey, go sit in the beanbag and chill out for a minute. They're going to be peeling off the baseboard, picking a hole in the beanbag, and there seems to be this need. Sometimes where kids are, if they're wearing a hooded sweatshirt, right, when they start to get dysregulated, they're really starting to wrap those strings around their hands and that kind of thing. I had a little guy, every time he got mad, tore a page out of a textbook. And he had a lot of property destruction. If he was mad, he would take his shoe off and he'd throw it at the projector. He'd kick a trash can in half. So he was the first one that I ever tried a mad basket with. And the idea was, okay, as long as they're in this basket, and these are things that you can manipulate. So there's not a list of these are the things that should be in a mad basket because they're individualized for the student. For Billy, he had a phone book in there that he could tear a page out of a phone book if he felt like tearing a page was going to make him feel better. I've had kids that like bubble wrap. I've had kids that just want to squeeze a stress ball. I had this one guy, I would not use this with most kids, but he could take 3 large paper clips and he would take the paper clip and he would open it all the way up and then he'd try to put it back. And if you do that a couple of times, the piece is going to break off and he'd set it aside, and he could do that with 3 paper clips and then it seemed better. And Alex will even tell me now, like sometimes he feels like he wants to hit me. He never has. He's like, I just get that feeling that I'm so mad. But if I can squeeze something, he feels better. And sometimes that, like one day it was an empty water bottle sitting on the counter and he's like, oh, I just feel so frustrated. And he grabbed it and he, made it into like this little ball of plastic and he set it down and went, oh. Like I could tell like that was for some reason for him somewhat helpful. Now, The one thing is people will tell me is that there's only a certain time that this works, right? So think about that in that 5-point scale where 5 is where you're just really dysregulated. A stress basket is going to work at a 2, maybe a 3. Past that, giving them those kinds of things, you just handed them a basket of weapons, right? They're all going to be thrown at you. They're going to say, forget this. They're going to throw stuff. They're not going to use it. So sometimes in the beginning, it takes a while to start recognizing some of those early signs. I have kids that, like, again, they don't know what it looks like to start seeing some of those early signs. So I may point out to a student, I may go over and say, hey, I can see you're writing really hard with a pencil, and this is what your eyebrows look like right now. And I kind of make the face that they're making. So that tells me you're feeling a little frustrated. Maybe you're a 2, maybe you're starting to get into yellow. What's something we can do to get you back on track, right? So you try to teach them to catch themselves earlier in the process. Again, exercise, we know there's lots of literature and research that shows that exercise and movement and those kinds of things. Even running an errand, I see a kid that's starting to get dysregulated, and I may say, oh gosh, Joey, come over here. I totally forgot to give this letter to Mrs. Smith, and she's right across the room, right across the hallway, and maybe Joey delivers 5 notes in a day in the beginning that are all blank letters, but it's something that gets him moving and up and somewhat distracted. And then anything that we can do where we work in ways that do not involve sitting in a chair. So any kind of movement is helpful. The next area gets into relaxation and teaching kids. I know there's a lot of stuff on mindfulness and some of those kinds of things. There's not a lot of literature that helps us understand, whether or not those things are effective, but there are some ways that kids can use strategies to kind of again, bring them into that green zone if that's where they want to go. So in the zones of curriculum, one of the things they talk about is called the lazy 8 breathing. It's got this worksheet, and it's got the letter 8, not the letter, the number 8 sitting on its side. And the idea is that kids look at that and they trace it slowly while they inhale and exhale, right? Because I had this kid one time, I'm like, okay, I know you're upset, let's take a deep breath. And he went, well, that's not the kind of deep breath that's going to be helpful, right? It needs to be slowly in and slowly out. So I've had kids that are working on tracing it and working on taking a deep breath. That can be helpful for some kids. The zones of regulation has great worksheets, but they're not necessarily all that appropriate for middle school and high school. But I had a middle school student who was becoming very dysregulated, changing classes, right? He would be okay in class, then he had to go to the next class, and he's in the hallway, and there's all these kids in the lockers, and he didn't have real good social skills, so he would just come into the next class, just, a mess. And so I liked the idea of the lazy 8 breathing, but I needed to modify it. I'm obviously not going to give him a little worksheet with an 8 on it, but I told him, okay, buddy, hold your books in this hand, and then at arm's length with your index finger, I want you to trace an 8 slowly on your leg, so that you can think about breathing in and breathing out. Didn't work every single time, but there are times where he could work on kind of concentrating on his breathing during the transition as opposed to, again, getting very dysregulated. Visualization, so a little different. I'm not really talking about let's all close our eyes and think about being on the beach, although that might be really nice right now. What I like to do with this is that I do this in a way to help kids who have those cognitive distortions. Remember, those are the kids that are like, I'm dumb, I can't do anything right, nobody likes me. And what I've done is that a lot of times when kids get into those cognitive distortions, we as adults will say, well, that's not true, you have some friends, or that kind of thing, and it gets into this, well, no, I don't. So what I did with this one student that had a lot of these kind of rigid ideas is that every time we did something really fun or cool, or they got a 98% on their spelling test, I made a copy of it and I kept it in a binder, and then we ended up getting some other stuff. I put it in a tote. So that way, when he started getting into these cognitive distortions and he's like, I'm so dumb, I can't do anything right, I could get out the paper that showed that he got a 98% on a spelling test, which is easier to show them and have them shift and visualize maybe some more positive thinking when there's a tangible thing, right? Instead of me just saying, well, no, you're not, you do good with this, I have something that's like a physical product. So for some kids with those very severe, significant cognitive distortions, having things that can help redirect them is also sometimes helpful. The other one has to do with music with headphones. So this is a little bit different. Some people think about, well, maybe calm music would help. Not exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so what I like to help people kind of visualize first, this is something that Alex's counselor did. So if you think about, like, visualize in yourself or up here, whatever, on either side I have a fishing net, right? There's a fishing net right here and there's a fishing net right here. This one's just a regular fishing net, like one you see anywhere. This one, on the other hand, this fishing net has a hole in the bottom. So anything that goes in the fishing net is just going to fall out the bottom. She used this as an analogy to help understand how people sometimes process anxiety, right? So people that are able to process anxiety have a fishing net with a hole in the bottom, because everybody experiences negative thoughts. You can't not have your mind occasionally think of a negative thought. But when you process those things well, I have a negative thought, it goes in my fishing net, I don't want to really think about it, falls out the bottom, right? But people that have anxiety and stress and have a hard time with those negative thoughts, they have the fishing net without a hole in it, right? So one thought goes in, and then another thought goes on top of it, and then another thought goes on top of it, and it builds and it builds. And a good example of this, I'm lucky that my parents are able to help a lot with Alex. And he's 20. There's no such thing as a babysitter for someone with bipolar who occasionally feels like hurting himself. So we get very few breaks, but Alex has a really good relationship with my dad specifically. And so that, they'll go play golf together, do different kinds of things. And he just really, really has this great relationship with my dad. In January, my dad turned 76. As his daughter, occasionally I was like, oh, my dad's aging. That's going to be hard when I have to deal with that. Thank goodness he's healthy now and I don't have to worry about it, right? I have this thought, it goes in my net and I let it go. Alex, who has some anxiety, he'll start saying, like, or especially around my dad's birthday, like, Mommy turned 75 or 76 or what are we going to do? Like, he's going to die someday. How are we going to handle that? And like, he's having all of this anxiety where these thoughts are just piling up. I'm like, honey, don't worry about it. Just let it go. But he doesn't have the same type of fishing net, right? So one of the things that I realized that was helpful for Alex, and I didn't know why it was helpful when he was younger, is he likes to listen to music when he falls asleep. And if you think about it, if you're gonna have negative thoughts, when do they happen the most? Laying in bed, trying to fall asleep. There's nothing else competing. And so you're laying in bed sometimes when you've got stress going on and you can't fall asleep sometimes because of these negative thoughts. Well, Alex always used music when he went to sleep. There was a night, this was before he even had a phone, I guess, because he was pretty young, and he would listen to it on either my phone or my husband's phone. They were both dead, so we were charging them. And he's like, I need my music. I'm like, well, I don't have music tonight. Can you just try to go to bed without it? And he's like, no, I can't. And I'm like, well, why can't you go to sleep without your music? He's like, it's the only thing that makes the words stop in my head. I mean, he was young at the time, but to be able to describe, like, when I lay here and there's nothing else to think about, I'm thinking about all the things that I worry about. And so I've always given him music to listen to. Again, this is why I say it's not necessarily soft, quiet music, because some of the music that Alex listens to fall asleep, I don't know how he falls asleep, right? So it's not necessarily that it's this soft music. And I say with headphones, because if you have kids that would benefit from helping with their anxiety and some of that kind of stuff, obviously they can listen to music, maybe put some headphones in and participate in the classroom. I give a lot of these examples not as these are all the things that you should have in place, but rather a list of things that you can try with different kids. Some kids are going to do great with music, some aren't. Some will be very distracted by it. So it's more of a list of things that you can continue to try to see what works for that particular student to help with their regulation. And then the other one has to do with the time in. I wish I had known this when my son was younger. Remember I talked about the time when he would be playing with the friends and I'd be sitting on the driveway and then he'd end up pushing someone, right? So these are kids that with that inability to inhibit, they have trouble in PE and recess and some of those unstructured times. Well, a time in is that instead of sending them to PE, and you know about 10 minutes into PE, they always have a problem, is that 8 minutes, I'm gonna get them and do a time in, right? I'm gonna do something that's gonna like catch it before the behavior happens. Now, sometimes you also have to be very creative with this, because I'm trying to think back, like when Alex was playing with all of his friends, and I would have said, Alex, why don't you come over here and talk to me? Like, right? He's like not going to come over and talk to his mom. So how could I have creatively done that? Thinking back, I could have probably said, hey, Alex, I bought a bunch of popsicles at the grocery store today. Come inside with me and help get them all ready. We'll hand them out to everybody, right? He would have loved that, to be able to be the one to hand everybody a popsicle. But what am I doing? Like, we're walking slowly. Maybe I'm having him take a deep breath, and I'm getting him regulated again instead of waiting like I did for him to push somebody, right? So we could maybe do a time in. Another piece that I learned a couple years ago, it was very helpful for me, that I hadn't really thought of before. Alex has been in the hospital multiple times trying to get his medication right, and when you go into those kind of programs, there's also like, group therapy kind of stuff that they do. And so he would always work on identifying coping skills so that the next time he could handle his frustration. So he would come home with these lists sometimes that I would put him on the refrigerator, but he wasn't always using them. Here's partly why. I went to a conference with someone that did some training on conscious discipline, which is a really good regulation program for early childhood, like prior to kids coming to school. And they do a lot of stuff with regulation. And she said something that she just kind of told this story. So like, let's pretend you're in your classroom and your principal comes in, or special ed director, someone comes in and says, hey, I have some bad news. I said, we had a board meeting last night and we're eliminating your position. So today's your last day, right? That would be horrible. The look on your face would probably be like, oh my gosh, I just lost my job. If your principal or sped director or someone says, oh, I can tell you're feeling kind of frustrated, you might want to go sit over at your desk and use some coping skills. We'd be like, of course not. That's not how we're going to handle it, because the minute that person leaves, everybody's going to do the same thing. Everybody's got the one person that you're going to call and you're going to say, oh my gosh, I just lost my job. I don't know what I'm going to do. Which means that regulation is a two-person job, not a one-person job. And what I was doing with Alex is he would get frustrated. I'm like, go pick something off your list, go to your room, use a coping skill. He wasn't using the coping skill because the coping skills are typically things we do with another person. There's a connection of how we let other people help us through those things. So one of his refusals is last year as a senior was just going to school. Like, school was hard for him. He didn't like it. He didn't feel like he had any friends. And when I stopped and worked on talking him through it and being a part of that regulation, I got him to school a whole lot faster than when I was busy and said, well, you're going, figure it out, right? I noticed that difference. And then we have cognitive strategies. So the third area, there is something in the zones of regulation that's pretty cool. It talks about big problem versus little problem. So it's one of the lessons. And it's got kind of like, you'd look almost like a bar graph, where we've got a really tall bar over here and it says huge problem, and they get a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller. There's a little bar over here and it says tiny problem. So the idea is that we try to teach kids that there are different sizes of problems and we respond differently based on those sizes. So I'll sometimes tell kids a huge problem is when someone's house gets flooded. A tiny problem is when somebody picked the blue person before you could to play Candyland, right? So we kind of teach them the different size of a problem. She also includes some of the work, again, of Michelle Garcia Winter. She does a lot of things on social thinking, but she has a program that looks at Superflex and Rockbrain. Superflex is the superhero in the program who's a very flexible person. Rockbrain, the villain, is not flexible, right? So there's different ways to kind of teach kids skills to be more flexible. And it's a really cool program. Then we get into like cognitive academic strategies, right? So what do we need to do to like set up the environment for success? So some of the things I've talked about, the stopping point strategy. Can you put that in place, that you teach kids to appropriately get to a stopping point in order to make those transitions? Anything that we can do with visual prediction, right? We want to know like things like, how much do I have to do, and when do I know it's over, and how long is it going to last? All of those kinds of things. I always tell people, you know, in my workshops, like, you may think this is a good workshop or a bad workshop, but either way, you want to know when it's over, right? And a lot of people have probably already, you know, sometimes think like, is she the kind of presenter that's going to like let us out early? You know, those kinds of things, because even though it might be something that you're enjoying, you still want to know when it's over. And when kids don't know that prediction of how much they have to do, it can cause problem behaviors. A little girl with autism, she was doing some math, didn't do paper pencil math, it was all hands-on. The teacher had made a bunch of index cards and wrote single-digit addition problems on the cards. And so Emma had, like, maybe she would pull a card off the pile and it would say 1 + 2, right? And so she had to get 1 Unifix cube and then 2 Unifix cubes and put them all together and they would count. Then that math problem would go to the back of the pile, right? So she just keeps doing these math. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, how much math does she have to do? I don't see when there's going to be an end. She starts getting anxious, is screaming a little bit. I'm like, you guys, she just doesn't know when this is over. It's not so much that she doesn't like math. She just needs more predictability. So we took a number line, we made a number line on a strip of paper, 1 through 10, laminated it. I said, put it in with her math manipulatives. You get out the number line, you get the cards. As soon as you do the first one, you mark through number 10, then you mark through number 9. And as she can see, then she sees when it's over. She stopped screaming during math just by making it predictable. So anything we can do for that predictability. Warm-up activities can sometimes be helpful. Remember, we have kids that don't initiate. They don't get started on things. Little guy that didn't initiate math very well because it was also an area that was difficult for him. The teacher in this classroom, it was like a 3rd grade classroom, and they actually they were like the last lunch shift. So it was like 12:30 before they had lunch. So they had a long morning, and so they'd basically just finished science. They'd been sitting for a while. They still had math to do right before going to lunch. So the kids get up, they get a drink of water, they're making this transition, and in order to start math, all the kids would stand in a circle in the classroom, and the teacher had a Nerf ball, and they all knew that they were supposed to ask a 1-digit by 1-digit addition problem. And so the teacher might start and she'd say 2 + 1, and she'd throw it to someone, they had to catch it, they had to answer it, then they had to come up with it. And we made it really easy math. Like 3rd graders pretty much know those types of math facts, so no one felt on the spot. But what are we doing? We're up, we're moving, we're doing some math already. That sometimes would help with that initiation by doing kind of a warm-up activity. Modified work, someone else to write, shorten assignments. Again, I think sometimes people have a hard time with doing some of those modifications because I get things from teachers where they'll say, well, that's not fair. They need to do it like all the other kids are doing it, and those kinds of things. And an example, I was in a classroom doing a consultation. It was a 5th grader, and the first day that I consulted, he was in the back of the room refusing the whole time, and the teacher didn't really do much about it. And she even told me, she's like, this kid refuses. I don't know how to get him to do his work. I just know if he sits in the back and I don't bother him, he doesn't bother anybody else, and I can at least teach 22 other kids, right? She's like, I know that's wrong, but I don't know what else to do. So I came in the next, couple weeks later or whatever, because I'm still doing some assessment. She's like, you won't believe what happened. I'm like, oh, what happened? She's like, well, I let all the kids do their assignment on a Chromebook, and he asked to do it. She's like, he got 100%. He got it all right. Even though, I thought he was sitting in the back, he's actually listening to everything and learning some of it. And here my first thought is, wow, how can we get a Chromebook, right? That must have been more motivating for him. So I'm like, well, can you get a Chromebook for him to do it more often? And she's like, well, no. I'm like, oh, why? Well, not everybody else gets to use a Chromebook. And I'm thinking, so many kids learn better or more easily than teachers do, I guess, that there's a difference between fair and equal, right? It's not all equal. We don't all need glasses, but it's fair in that everybody gets what they need. And usually if you say Joey here needs a little bit more than you do, it's no newsflash to the kids. They know Joey's been the one that's been disruptive. So if we can, we want to be able to modify that work, have someone else to write, that kind of thing. But that doesn't mean that you write for them forever either. It means that we do that as a modification for them to be successful, but then we're going to continue a little bit at a time to make them right. I see either end of the spectrum there. They don't modify at all, or they modify so much and they don't fade it. Both of those things can be a problem. Anything that we can do with checklists. So remember, with the short-term memory, how many times do I have to tell you? Writing things down. Maybe our middle school student has a little Post-it in the back of the locker, as discreet as possible, that has the checklist of don't forget these things. It can be a number of ways. Self-monitoring, so kids that monitor their own behavior. Billy was a kid that I worked with who I did a self-monitoring, and basically I had several subjects, and there were 4 questions that he had to ask after each subject. So after reading, he had to circle yes or no, and they were questions like, did I come in quietly and get started on my work? Or did I use my materials appropriately, right? I first did this, and every time he said yes, 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 I was perfect every time, even though he wasn't. So he wasn't actually monitoring his behavior. So I changed the data sheet so that each box had 2 yeses and 2 nos. And what I did is I gave him points for matched answers, right? If we both said yes, he got 3 points. If we both said no, he still got 1 point. And each point led to, I think, like 20 minutes of the computer at the end of the day. And I remember, so even saying no, but matching mine is a benefit because he gets another point. And I remember the first time he circled no, it was, did I use my materials appropriately? And he said no. I'm like, yeah, I also said no. What did you do? And he's like, well, I was swinging my scissors around on my finger. I'm like, yeah, that could be unsafe. He's like, I know, I'll work on it, right? But he was starting to evaluate his own behavior. That's sort of a higher level of behavior intervention and strategies. Another one can be a voice control monitor. So how can we work with kids to understand their voice volume? Billy was, I've talked about him a couple of times. So he's in the gen ed classroom with a para. The teacher's talking. Billy would talk to the para. The para would tell him to stop talking, and now all 3 of them are talking, right? So there's this disruption. If we can ever make it visual of some sort for kids, we just took like a piece of paper and folded it into thirds and made a little tent that said no talking on one side. You flip it, it said quiet talking, and then medium voice or something like that, so that she could just prompt him with the volume of his voice by looking at a visual instead of verbally, which then ended up being more disruptive. So again, lots of kids do well with various types of visuals. I had this little guy with autism, and I asked the teacher, she's like, one of the things that drives me crazy is he comes into my classroom, it's mostly kids with learning disabilities, but I like to spend about 10 or 15 minutes reading a book. I want the kids to be quiet so they listen, so I want to ask some questions to figure out their listening comprehension. But this little guy with autism would not be quiet, right? He's like, I have a dog, and he wanted to tell this story and all that kind of stuff. She's like, I can't get him to stop making comments about the book. So I modeled for them how a visual would work, and I had this little card, and on one side said, you can talk, and the other side said quiet. It might have had something like that where it showed no talking. So we were doing work. I was also having him earn 5 pennies to be able to get a break. I had a little pennies on Velcro thing. So he was earning his pennies. He was doing really well. The last penny was going to be for him to listen to me read. So I flipped it over, and we had been practicing, okay, this means no talking. And so I read like 5 pages from a Scooby-Doo book, right? And he did great. He did not say a word. And so then I'm like, you did so amazing. And I gave him the 5th penny. And I was like, it looks like you might have enough of them. Let's count them. And he just stared at me. And I knew he knew how to count. I hadn't turned the card over yet. So he still was in a no talking, right? So I flipped the card over so that he could talk again. And he's like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, free time. So he was so literal with it. But that's all it took to get him to be able to participate in that activity better. Some kids do well with an organizational binder system in terms of remember teaching some of that organization. Some kids do well to have a green notebook and a green folder for science and a red notebook and a red folder for social studies. Others, that's way too much. So looking at ways to teach that organization, and again, we have to reinforce behavior that we want to see more of. So to just send out all the papers and hope it gets where it's supposed to go, or do you need to say, hey Joey, here's a piece of paper. I would like to see where that goes. Does it go in this side of your pocket folder because it's things that go home? Is it homework, or is it maybe something you put in the recycle and you follow through and then reinforce that? That's what sometimes needs to happen for things to be taught. And then having those backup items. I was in an IEP for my son. This was when he was in the first year of middle school. He had a really hard time. He was bullied some, pushed in a locker one time. But he has terrible executive function skills, much, much better now as he gets older. But he was the one that always showed up to class without being prepared. And we're in this meeting, and the teacher's like, you know what? He needs to learn to be prepared. So I'm just going to take 2 points off every time he comes without his materials. Luckily, I was really good friends and worked a lot with the special education director who was in there, and she's like, you know what? I think Alex is probably more worried about getting from his locker to his class without being pushed into one again. So why don't we just have an extra pen or pencil in the classroom? Granted, yes, I have the extra. Do I need to look at how do I teach him to remember it? Absolutely. But having those backup items, I think, are important. Okay, think 3, does he understand? Is the reinforcement clear? And have you incorporated choice? When I've worked with kids with autism in the past, I would go in to do a consultation and there were no visuals and supports in place. And knowing about working with kids with autism, visual supports are like Autism 101, right? You need schedules and social stories and all those kinds of things. So I would oftentimes say, put the prerequisites in place and then I'll come back. I felt like the same thing was happening when we're asking kids to do things, in that sometimes I noticed that the prerequisites were not in place. And so anytime you ask a kid to follow a direction, these 3 things should all be clear to the student. One is, does he understand? Does he know what he's supposed to do? Is it a can't versus a won't? Is the reinforcement clear? Does he know how reinforcement is going to show up if he chooses to do the activity? And choice is also a big one. So I'm going to give you some examples here. Does he understand? Again, we talked about visual prediction. Sometimes kids have behavior not because they want to have refusals, but because things don't go the way they thought they were supposed to. That's very different than saying he didn't get his way. I had another kid, I'll say his name is Joey, had Asperger's syndrome. I only saw him at the end of the day twice a week for social skills. So I never had any problem behavior. He was in the gen ed classroom, no para, very high functioning, did great. In January at a sub, first day his teacher had been out. I'm like, oh, well, I know people with autism sometimes have trouble with change, so I better prepare this for him. And I told him, you're gonna have a sub tomorrow. Didn't really think too much of it. The next day, first thing in the morning, the office is calling down to my room, like, we're having trouble with Joey. I'm like, well, that's weird. We've never had trouble with Joey. So I go in, and he's sitting in his desk with his arms crossed like this. He's just really, really mad. And I'm like, Joey, what's going on? He's like, you see that lady over there? She calls herself a teacher. And I was like, yeah, what's going on? She is trying to make us do math. It's 9 o'clock. We always do spelling at 9 o'clock, right? So it was just the first time he really had a change that he's having a refusal. It had to do with not having things predicted well enough for him. Again, any kind of curriculum adaptations that we can do. The behavior momentum is kind of like those warm-up activities. We're kind of trying to get things moving in the right direction. With visual prediction, it can be, again, anything like schedules, calendars, planners. We want to be able to answer the question, how much and when is it over? And visual pictures on cue cards to use the stress management tools. So if we're using some of those tools, we might need a visual to prompt them to say, hey, these are some of the things that you can do when you go from the green zone to the yellow zone and you want to get back to the green zone. Another piece that I think is important is understanding is the reinforcement clear. So something that I always tell people, like if you learn one thing that you start doing next week, is the as soon as statement. Anytime I ask a student to do something, I want to say, as soon as you do this, this is what will happen. And it does a couple of things. It kind of takes the power struggle out, right? You need to do math. I don't want to. Well, you have to. I'm not going to. Well, then you're doing it for homework, right? You're more likely to get into a back and forth power struggle versus, hey, buddy, here's some math. As soon as you do it, we'll take a break. The other thing that it does is it makes you put the contingency in place, right? Because I've had teachers and they're like, well, how about as soon as you do your math, you can do science, which you also hate, right? Like that's not going to work. You have to have a contingency in place. And I've had teachers that say, okay, so I use the as soon as statement. As soon as you finish your math, you can. She's like, I don't know what should be there. That's the problem. There needs to be some type of reinforcement. Again, Joey, my little guy that's cussing at us, Jessica kept saying, hey buddy, as soon as you do one puzzle piece, we'll go back outside to swing, right? It kind of takes that power struggle out and it makes you put in the reinforcement. Now, another example that I like to give is another example with my son. I grew up in a very small town, moved away to go to school and teach and all those kinds of things, moved back to this small town because it's close to my parents who help a lot with Alex. And I mean, it's a very small town in rural Missouri, and a lot of people, they like to duck hunt. Dumbest thing on the face of the planet to me, but it's something that happens in our area. And both of my boys and my husband, after we moved back to this little town, decided that, yeah, we're gonna be duck hunters now, right? They're all excited about it, whatever. All I know is they're gone for the weekend and my daughter and I can get a lot of shopping in, so I try not to complain too much, right? So there's this day, they're supposed to go duck hunting in the afternoon with my uncle, go to this new blind, whatever they do. And the boys were excited about it. We had just recently moved into a new house, and part of our driveway is gravel. We had a bunch of gravel delivered. It didn't all, it's not all put in the right spot. So Brian's like, hey boys, I want you to come out and help me move the gravel. Well, Andrew, our middle son, probably doesn't like it, but he does, and he goes out. And then Alex decides he's gonna have some refusals, right? He's like, no, I'm not going. I don't want to, it's hot, and starting to frustrate my husband, right? Well, I told you you have to, but I don't want to. And so they're kind of getting into this, back and forth kind of thing, and Alex is refusing. Finally, Brian's like, fine, you don't come out and help, we're not going duck hunting. Well, what that sometimes does for our kids when they think they've lost a privilege is they go to a level 5. Remember, a level 5 means I've lost IQ points. So at this point, he's unable to understand what's going on. I come in, I'm like, hey, if you go ahead and help, you can get it back. No, it's gone. He's just completely lost it. And I've been trying to get Brian to do this, and he's doing much better now. Use an as soon as statement, right? Alex, this is how much you have to help, and as soon as you finish it, we'll go duck hunting. Doesn't the exact same thing happen? He doesn't get to go do the thing that he wants to do until he helps with the gravel, but it didn't have the appearance of, fine, I'm taking it away. It's just, this is what you have to do, and as soon as you do it, this is gonna happen next. I actually did a training yesterday, and they were some people that had been through some of my other training, and there's like, we just want to let you know that if there was one thing that almost seemed magical, it was the as soon as statement, that you can really get kids to follow directions in that way. We also might have kids that say, I am working for, and they have different things that they know that they're motivated, and then consequence maps. So another example to go into consequence maps, this is my first book that I published called Behavior Mapping, and it's a visual strategy for teaching appropriate behavior to individuals with autism spectrum and related disorders, but it's not just autism. That's who published it, and they wanted the word autism on there, so that's fine, but it shows how to do these behavior maps. So real quick, I had a student, and I was really trying to use my as soon as statement, right? But he had a lot of non-compliant behavior. I'm like, as soon as you get this reading done, you can take a break. And he just didn't seem to like a lot of the things that I was offering as reinforcers. So he kept asking, can I bring in things from home? I'm like, well, no, but then yes, right? I said, I'll change my mind. Maybe that would be a better reinforcer. So he comes in that day, he's got like 3 things, toys or whatever that he brought in from home. I had like this plastic tote box underneath his backpack hook. And I'm like, okay, Billy, as soon as you come in, put your stuff in the box, right? He did. Got to do your math first, then you get to play with your stuff. He did his math faster and better than I had ever seen, right? He was really excited to be able to go play with this stuff. So he goes to his box, he gets the things out, sits on the floor like in a bean bag or something, and he's playing with this stuff. And I think I set a timer for 5 minutes, right? You get a little 5-minute break with this stuff. The timer goes off, and I'm like, okay, Billy, it's time to put it away. He's like, no, I don't want to. I'm like, oh, well, you have to because, it's time to get back to work. So I said, well, if you don't put it away, I'm gonna start helping you because the timer went off. And he's like, no, no, no. And then I would reach down and try and kind of start helping him, and he would lose it. Partly because I was making him stop playing with the stuff, but mostly he said that I was, in his mind, violating a social rule in that you don't touch people's personal belongings without their permission, right? And so I kept telling him, like, Billy, I will never touch your stuff if you put it away, right? Like, I'm trying to help him understand this cause and effect. Hey, buddy, I'll never touch it. You just put it away. And he wasn't getting that cause and effect. And then sometimes at the end of the day, I'd say, here's some homework. I don't have homework. I said, yeah, remember you got upset and you stayed upset for like an hour? Remember, we never went to math class, so this is what you missed. This is what you have to do. I don't have math homework. He wasn't getting it. And I'm like, I stopped for a minute and I'm like, wait a minute, he has autism. I know kids with autism need visual supports. I think this is a really important thing to make this visual, because I wasn't making it visual. I was just like telling him. So here's an example of one of my first behavior maps where he could read, it didn't need pictures, just teaching him cause and effect, right? So he has 5 minutes of free time. Green arrows are usually our good choices here. You can stop when the timer goes off and get back to work. You can finish your work, and I earned 5 minutes at the computer, which went into like a bank towards the end of the day, and then you get 5 minutes to play again. But if you come down here and you choose not to stop, Mrs. Smith is gonna help you put your things away. She's gonna touch them. And then if you continue to refuse, you might have to go to the hallway or go to the ISS room. He wasn't in trouble like going to ISS. It was just the only place that he could work that wasn't disrupting everybody, because he was very loud when he was upset. So again, this took like 1 or 2 times. He could see that if I make this choice, this is how I get to this end result. But if I happen to make this one, I get to this end result, which I don't like very much. And just making that visual was very helpful. We started using some with pictures. So my little guy, Andrew would get his work finished without hitting, and he gets to make a copy on the copy machine. Why would he make a copy on the copy machine? Because for him, that was reinforcing. This kid got all of his work done to be able to make 2 copies on a copy machine. Remember, reinforcement is an effect in that it increases behavior, not a thing. Might not be very reinforcing to us, but it was to him. You see down here, he doesn't work, it says no work, or he hits, then there's no copy machine. And when I first started doing these, we really found a lot of kids that benefited from having the words and the pictures. And I had a guy that worked for me at the center who illustrates children's books. His name is Eric. So this is his work. Like I would go in and I would say, Andrew, I need a behavior map for copy. And he could like literally do this in 10 minutes. He's a very good artist. He leaves to take a job at a community college to teach some art classes. Always what he wanted to do, very happy for him. I lost my artist, right? And so like I'm barely good enough to do a stick figure. And we found that these are hard to do. We have to cut out pictures and put them in order. So we did, my colleague and I, Tara Hayes, we put together a program, it's computer-based, that basically helps you make these behavior maps if you're not good at drawing and you need visuals. And so basically this comes up as a template where all these circles are blank. And if you click on the first one, over here it's going to give you a menu of different boys and girls of different ethnicities and hair colors. Then you got good behaviors here. You could actually add a second circle, so there's 2 and a reinforcer. So he gets his math finished, he gets the iPad. This one has the not so good behaviors, and all of the typical reinforcers have an X through them. I always tell people it was really funny. I was working with this graphic artist. I'm like, I need a picture of a kid cussing and hitting and spitting. And she's like, why do you need that? I'm like, because kids in my world do that, you know, it's different. But the idea is, again, that you can put the words and the content, it prints on a full landscape piece of paper. And the other nice feature that we added is that you can take a picture from your smartphone and upload it into the menu, because I obviously don't have a copy machine, right? I have very typical kinds of reinforcers, but if you have a kid that likes a copy machine, you would have to take the picture, upload it, and then it'll automatically go in there. So the program is behaviormappingmaker.com. It might be something that would be beneficial for you to help make those behavior maps if, again, you're not good at drawing. I've had plenty of kids that I just write them. They don't need pictures. So this is if you need pictures and if you need help drawing. This would probably be a good resource for you. Okay, now the third thing of Think 3 has to do with have you incorporated choice. Again, these are our kids with oppositional defiant disorder. Do you want to sit? And they'll stand for an hour, right? So anything that you suggest is oftentimes they're very resistant. So the more that you can include a choice, the better. And again, kids that are 3, I think many of them could meet the criteria for ODD, because I have rarely met a 3-year-old. They all refuse to wear their coat when it's 2 degrees outside, right? We get into some of this resistance and stuff. So in one of the programs, it was, you know, like with your 3-year-old, you say, hey, it's time to go. Do you want to wear it or carry it, right? You just make it into a choice, and it takes some of the power struggle out. So I might say to the child, do you want to do this one or this one? And maybe it's 2 different math papers, or math and reading. Do you want to do it with the crayons or the markers? Do you want to do it sitting here or sitting there? This is always a good one, too, for kids that don't initiate. Do you want me to do the first one or you do the first one? And so what you have to be careful is I'll be in a classroom and they'll say, okay, honey, are you ready for math? And they say, nope. Well, if you ask the question, then typically we're like, oh, well, then I'm going to say, well, it's okay, I'll help you. And like they get more upset because you didn't listen to them the first time. Don't ask the question unless you're okay with the answer. So what I'm going to say is, hey, buddy, it's time for math. But do you want to get a clipboard and do it sitting in the beanbag or in my chair, right? Those are 2 pretty cool things, and it's going to increase the likelihood that kids are going to make good choices. Okay, so I have one more story to go along with Think 3. So again, summarizing these things, we need to make sure that the child understands and that there's reinforcement clear and have you incorporated choice. So this is a situation that happened at my school, Center for Autism. We have a program of kids with emotional disorders, and we had this new guy start with us. He was probably 6th, 7th grade, something like that. He had Asperger's, high-functioning autism, but his main diagnosis was oppositional defiant disorder. He literally refused most things that someone suggested, and so we had a lot of resistance. He starts, and most of our classes have 2, 3, maybe 4 kids. And he immediately meets this kid, let's see, I'll say, so the kid that I'm talking about with Asperger's syndrome, I'll say his name is Joey and his friend is Tommy, right? And Joey decides that Tommy's his best friend. They're in class together, and Tommy agrees that Joey's his best friend, but they can't stand each other, right? They always want to sit by each other, but then he's touching me and he's doing that, so they're constantly at each other, and so we're kind of having this peer relationship stuff. So I knew that the boys both were having a little bit of trouble, but my staff came to me and said, Amy, we don't know what to do during lunch. Lunch is a disaster. We basically have 12 of the hardest behavior kids come from 13 different school districts, and we want them to go back to the public school as soon as possible, so we want to teach them how to handle things like the lunchroom. So they're all eating together. Half my staff have to go have their lunch, so we're short-staffed. We're trying to get lunches warmed up, and there's all these behaviors. My staff's like, it's a nightmare. You got to come help us with some behavior tips or something. So I'm like, okay, so I'm going to come observe. So I go in, and I'm kind of getting my stuff settled so that, like, if I needed to take notes or whatever. And I mean, it was like these 2 kids over here were arguing, and one was insulting his mother, and one was like getting mad about where he was sitting and all this kind of stuff. And my 2 boys that I was kind of there to watch weren't even there yet. But this other kid, he'd been there about 5 months, and this kind of chaos just drove him crazy. So he walks in and he's like, oh, and then he gave everybody the finger. And so I was like, oh, this is so fun, I love it. But at any rate, these 2 boys come in, and they both, you know, usually sat next to each other because they're best friends. But my staff had decided, since they argue the whole time, we should separate them, right? We didn't tell them that, we just decided to separate them. Now, the other thing I noticed is on the table, the kids had their names permanently taped to the table. I'm sure that they did that because the kids argued with where they had to sit. So I got Joey, my new friend, new student, Asperger's, ODD, and I noticed his name's not on the table. Joey, let's see, okay, so Joey and Tommy always sat next to each other. They decide to separate them, so they moved Tommy. The only open seat at the table had the name Zach taped to it. So now we put a kid named Tommy to sit in a chair where the taped name says Zach. So there's a couple of things that now Joey's pretty upset about, right? He's like, this is ridiculous. He cannot move. If he's gonna move, I get to move. Plus, he's not even sitting in the right name. And so he's mad, you didn't tell me he was gonna move. He's getting all, getting very riled up. And the staff are just like, hey buddy, I know, just go ahead and eat your lunch. I'm not eating my lunch. If he gets to move, I get to move. And so then he gets up and he's like, I'm gonna go sit wherever I want to. And they said, Joey, you need to go sit down. And he goes and sits down. He's like, this is so dumb. And then finally he's like, no, if he gets to move, I get to move, and I get to sit by him. So he picks up his pizza rolls, goes over to where his friend Tommy was, and like wedges himself in between 2 chairs. There's no chair. He's like, I'm gonna sit by him. You can't tell me I can't sit by my friend Tommy. And one of the staff said, Joey, you really can't eat standing up. He's like, yes, I can. And he took a bite. It was like, are you serious? And so I thought, okay, at this point, maybe I should intervene, as I'm seeing that this is getting kind of worse, getting a little worse. So, my first thing is like, hey buddy, I think there's been a misunderstanding. He looked at me, he's like, you think? I was like, yes, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I said, I don't know about you, but the fact that Tommy's sitting there where it says Zach, like that's kind of bothering me. He's like, it's about time somebody recognizes the ridiculousness going on in this cafeteria. And I was like, I know. And I said, your name's not on the table, I noticed. He's like, I know. I've been here 2 weeks. Nobody put my name on the table. Again, this kid hadn't learned how to disagree very politely yet. But I said, okay, well, tomorrow we're going to fix it. Your name's going to be on the table. I apologize. That's our problem. And I promise every kid is going to sit next to their actual name. He's like, okay. So does he understand? Like, he didn't understand. He has autism. You don't match up names wrong. Like, it was just very confusing for him. But I fixed that. I said, I'm fixing it tomorrow, and we're going to move him, and we're going to get this all right. Is the reinforcement clear? I now need him to follow directions. I need him to go sit down and eat his lunch. So how can I make sure that there's some reinforcement involved? We have a very large room where half of the room is where the cafeteria is and the other half we call it the motor room. And we have these very large adult size rocker chairs. So his favorite thing to do whenever he's finished with his lunch and gets it all cleaned up, the rest of the lunch period, he gets to sit in the rocker chair and look at, that's the only time he gets to get his phone out and look at his National Geographic app, his favorite thing. So I just reminded him, hey buddy, you gotta sit down, standing's not safe. As soon as you finish your lunch and you get it cleaned up, that's more time that you get to look at your phone. He's like, yeah, kind of thinking about that. And then have I incorporated choice? Like I've kind of got him redirected and I don't want to get into another power struggle, right? So I said, you really need to sit. Standing is not very safe. Do you want to sit in this chair or this one, right? So, because I don't want to get into another power struggle. He's like, I'll sit in that one. Sat down, finished his lunch, got to look at his phone. Is that going to work every time? Absolutely not. It's one example where when I saw a lot of refusals going on that I felt like these things were not in place. And when I put them in place, help him understand, remind him of the reinforcement, make a choice out of it, he got back on track. So just kind of an interesting story that really helps kind of see how important that Think 3 is.